Okay, so in this episode, we're looking at exploitation under capitalism. And to understand Marx's view about this, we need to have a bigger picture view of Marx's understanding of history. His history is, remember, the succession in modes of production. And I've tried to capture the basic picture, basic Marxist picture here in this slide. So here we have, well, there are 5 societies here: tribal society, which I'm not really going to talk about very much. And then that moves on to what Marx calls the ancient mode of production, which is slaves and slave owners, or as the Greeks called them, citizens and slaves. And then we move on from there to feudalism with lords and serfs. And then we move on to capitalism with capitalists and workers. And then finally we end up with communism. So, and on the left, we have low development in the forces of production, and on the right, high development in the forces of production. So in other words, as we travel through history, as we travel through these epochs, the forces of production develop more. That is, production gets better, basically, right? And in the beginning, there's communal relations of production, so everything is done as a society. And in the end, there's private relations of production. That's true under capitalism, so things are done privately. And the division of labour increases as we go through history. Okay, and we need to know how exploitation fits into this picture. I mean, I've got a series of slides that I hope will help us understand this. Okay, so let's start with the ancient mode of production. So here are some features of the ancient mode of production. First of all, we have slaves, and the slaves are owned by citizens. And then the slave's production is also owned by the citizen. So everything that the slave produces is owned by the slave owner. I'm just using citizen here because that's the term the Greeks used. The citizen must provide for the means of the slave's subsistence. The citizen has to provide food for the slaves, it has to provide the equipment that the slaves need to work with, and so on. All labour is for the citizen, so all labour that's done is for the citizen. And this is transparent. Everybody knows what's going on. The slaves know that they're slaves. The citizens know that they're citizens. The slaves know that when they're working in the, in the fields or whatever, they know what they're doing. They know who they're working for. This is all transparent. And this is sustained by force. The slaves know that if they revolt, they're going to get killed. That's more or less what's going to happen, or at least punished in some way. And this was particularly clear in the ancient world with the Spartans and the Helots. That, if you know anything about that history, I can't really go into it here, but the idea was if you revolted, the Spartans would kill you. So it's all sustained by force. Whereas in feudalism, the serf is not owned by the lord, the serf is tied to the land. So the serf has an obligation to work the land. The land that is ultimately owned by the landlord, as we say, the landlord, lord of the land, but the serf is tied to the land, not owned by the lord. The serf produces for himself and must pay rent to the lord. So the serf will farm his own plot of land, and he will survive on the food that plot produces, but he must also pay what was called rent to the lord. And this would sometimes be money, but more often something else, goods or labour. So some of the product of the land that the serf is working on would have to be given to the lord, or often labour. So this was the most prominent example. So let's just say, for example, the serf has to work 6 days a week. He works 4 days on his own land, but then he must go and work 2 days a week on the lord's land and produce for the lord. Okay, so the way this normally worked is that the serf was tied to the land but didn't own it. And because of that, the serf was understood to owe obligations to the landlord, and that would be to pay rent, whether that was to pay money or to provide goods or to labour on the landlord's land. So the serf produces the means of his own subsistence under feudalism. And there's a division in feudalism between necessary and surplus labour. So the necessary labour is the labour that the serf performs and needs to perform in order to provide for his own subsistence and the subsistence of his family. Of course, we are talking about men here. We are talking about actual historical examples, so that they were men. So that's necessary labour, the labour needed to provide for the serf's subsistence, and the surplus labour is the rent that goes to the lord. Okay, the surplus labour is transparent. It's transparent in space and time, by which I mean, to take the example of labour rent, the serf has to go to the landlord's land and work there, so that it's transparent in space, right? The serf has to actually go somewhere and work on the landlord's land, and it's transparent in time. It's those 2 days a week in the example that we were using before, that the serf has to work on the landlord's land. So that's transparent, that everyone knows what's going on here, nothing is hidden. And this is backed by force, but it's also justified by ideology. So, if the serf decides that he's not going to be a serf anymore, he's going to just, I don't know, sit around listening to music all day or something, then that will be backed up by force. But it's also justified by ideology, and we talked a little bit about this earlier when we were talking about Bentham and Locke. In feudal societies, there's an ideology that grows up that purports to justify the existence of the regime. So normally it'll be some religious ideology, and I mentioned exactly what it was before. In Europe, it was the idea that God had placed everybody in a particular position in society. That was God's will, and so the right thing to do was to accept one's place in society and live accordingly, and to try and upset that was viewed as a kind of blasphemy. So and that's very important to the success of feudalism. It wasn't just a regime maintained by force. It was a regime maintained in part by ideology, so that the people who were oppressed under feudalism, the serfs, nevertheless often willingly went along with it. Right? They knew that they were serfs, but they believed that was justified. They knew that they were paying rent. For example, they were working 2 days a week on the landlord's land, and all the produce of that work going to the landlord, but they believed that was justified, because that was justified by the ideology of the society in which they lived. Okay, now why then does the ancient mode of production give way to feudalism? And there are a number of answers, but here are some important ones. The first one is just in relation to what we were just talking about. Sustaining the system by force is inefficient. It's much more efficient if you can sustain the system by ideology. That is, if you can get the oppressed people to go along with their oppression, to accept their oppression, then that's much more efficient. Having to sustain oppression by force is very difficult. Because apart from anything else, people are always aware of the possibility of rebellion. So, for example, it was said in the south of the United States that people were very reluctant to leave their homes. That is, slave owners were very reluctant to leave their homes because they were worried that if they came back, they might find their families murdered by rebelling slaves. And this was a big deal for the Spartans too in ancient Greece. They were always restrained in what they could do in their. So, for example, during the Peloponnesian War, because of the worry that their slaves, in particular the helots, which is they were kind of slaves, entire enslaved populations that lived in the vicinity of Sparta, would revolt. The other reason is that so feudalism was much more efficient because the people who were oppressed under feudalism, the serfs, actually willingly went along with it because of the ideology. And the second reason is that slaves are not very productive. Right, a slave will do as little work as possible, whereas because the serf believes that the system under which they're operating is just, and also because the serf gets to retain some product of his own labour, the serf will be much more productive than the slave. Okay, so here, what I've done here is just kept the feudalism column from the previous slide, and we're just going to now compare feudalism and capitalism. So under feudalism, where the serf is tied to the land, under the capitalism the worker owns himself and is in that sense free. Right, the worker is not tied anywhere. The worker can move wherever he wants, live wherever he wants, and so on. The worker is free. Whereas under feudalism the serf produces for himself and must pay rent to the lord. Under capitalism, the worker has no access to the means of subsistence. This is very important. The worker cannot feed him, clothe or shelter himself except by working. And that's a result of something that we also discussed earlier in the course, the enclosure of the commons. So as a result of the enclosure of the commons, the worker has no access to the means of subsistence. He has to work for somebody else in order to feed himself. The worker must sell his labour power to the capitalist in order to obtain a wage. Now, this concept of labour power is very important to Marx, and I can't really do it justice here, but I just want to say this. Labour, what you sell for Marx is not your labour, but your labour power. And this means a lot of things, but one thing that it means that's important for us is that when you enter into a contract with a capitalist, you agree to do the work that the capitalist asks you to do. I mean, subject to the constraints of the contract. You don't agree to do a specific piece of work only. So under feudalism, there were rules about what the serf had to do that had existed for sometimes for centuries. You know, they had to, if you were born on this piece of land, then you had to, you were tied to that piece of land, and you had to provide a certain kind of rent for the feudal lord, and that was unchangeable. That's just the way things were. That's the way they'd been since, as they said, time immemorial. That's the way it was. It couldn't be changed, or not easily changed. But under capitalism, things are completely different. The capitalism hires you to do whatever work it is that the capitalist wants. So you don't sell specific pieces of labour, specific bits of labour. You sell your ability to work to the capitalist, and the capitalist gets you to do whatever it is that the capitalist wants you to do. So one day you might be, if you're in construction, you might be putting up a scaffolding. The next day you might be putting up bricks. The next day, whatever, you get the idea. And what you have to do is very malleable, very flexible. So in my case, I'm contracted to the university, and what I have to do is a year ago I was presenting this lecture in person, and now I have to do it online. That's just the way of it, right? I'm not contracted to do specific pieces of work. I'm contracted to work. My ability to work is what the university owns, and it puts me to various tasks. Okay, the next thing is this is free labour. Free labour in the sense that the worker can choose which capitalist to sell their labour to. So in my case, I've sold my labour to AUT, but I could have sold it to a different university. But the thing is that people must sell themselves to some capitalist, and that's a consequence of point 2. If you don't sell yourself, to some capitalist, then you starve to death. And so therefore, under feudalism, the serf was tied to a particular lord. Under capitalism, no worker is tied to any particular capitalist. But, says Marx, workers are nevertheless tied to the capitalist class as a whole, because they have to sell themselves to some capitalist. Not any particular capitalist, but they must sell themselves to some capitalist. So surplus labour is therefore opaque. The exploitation that exists under capitalism is hidden. And that's very important to understanding capitalism. We're going to have to talk more about that. The surplus labour that exists under capitalism is hidden. Okay, and this slide is designed to help us understand how exploitation under capitalism works. Okay, and it's just an example. It's just an example I've made up. So say that you work for me and you do 8 hours a day and I pay you $25 an hour. So, okay, so that's a total of $200 a day. So on the face of it, you know, you work 8 hours a day, I pay you an agreed amount, $25 an hour. I pay you for every hour that you work. Everything's fine, right? It looks okay. You feel good, right? I feel good, right? Everything's cool. Okay, what's the problem? Well, in this scenario that we're imagining, your work is worth more to me than I pay you for, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't hire you. The reason I'm hiring you is because your work is worth more to me than I'm paying you for. So imagine, for example, that in an 8-hour day, you produce $200 worth of value in 4 hours. Right, for me, you produce $200 worth of value for me in 4 hours. And I pay you $200 a day, so I pay you for that 4 hours work. But then the remaining 4 hours that you're at work, you're working for me, right? So if your work is worth $400 a day to me, then in effect, you're working half the day for you and half the day for me. But you don't see that. That's hidden. Right, the first 4 hours is necessary labour. That's the wage that you get. I pay you for that. That's you use that money to pay for your subsistence. The second 4 hours is surplus labour. You're working for me. The benefit of the surplus labour goes to me, not to you. So it appears that you're getting paid for 8 hours work, and of course legally you are, right, getting paid for 8 hours work, but in fact you're only being paid the value of 4 hours work. So capitalism, says Marx, is like feudalism, except that the exploitation is hidden. Right, under feudalism, remember, to change our example slightly, the serf would work 3 days a week on his own plot of land and 3 days a week on the landlord's plot of land. That's clear, it's obvious, it's clear what's happening. The guy has to walk over to that piece of land and he has 3 separate days. Everyone knows what's going on. But under capitalism, says Marx, the same thing is happening, but it's hidden. You're working half a day, in our example, you're working half a day for you and half a day for me, but we construct things so that it looks as if you're working the whole day for yourself. Okay, so there's the same kind of exploitation that existed under feudalism. There's the same kind of exploitation going on here, but that the exploitation is hidden. Okay, and as we see at the bottom of the slide here, efficiency for the capitalist, increasing efficiency, is the result of driving down the ratio of necessary to surplus labour. So what the capitalist wants to do is to get as much surplus labour as possible and as little necessary labour as possible. And the chief mechanism for this is technology. In Marx's day, it was the introduction of machinery into the factories, and we would think today about computers and so on, and artificial intelligence and so on. Now, it needs to be stressed here that the capitalist has to do this, right? The drive to push down the amount of necessary and increase the amount of surplus labour is essential. The capitalist has to do this to survive as a capitalist. So there's this idea that Marx believes that capitalists are all baddies and, they're out there deliberately trying to exploit people and horrible people and all this. That's not it at all. That's not his picture of it at all. Capitalism the system drives people in certain ways. And one of the ways in which it drives people is that it forces capitalists to try and achieve efficiency. It forces them to try and drive wages down, reduce the amount that they're paying people to increase exploitation. Because if they don't, then their competitors will, and their competitors will drive them out of business. And one might think, oh, this is not something, we'll talk about this later, this is not something that Marx thought enough about, actually. But one might think of the pressures on in the modern economy as well to provide returns for investors and so on. If you don't do this, you won't survive as a capitalist. That's absolutely essential. So capitalists aren't just sort of laying back, drinking cocktails and having a great time. It's not like that at all. They're under intense pressure to increase the level of exploitation. So Marx is not advancing any kind of psychological theory about, evil capitalists. He's not advancing a conspiracy theory. There's no conspiracy here. I think that's very important to remember. There's no conspiracy here. It's not that a whole bunch of capitalists have got together and are ripping us all off, and that's not it at all. What's happening is there's a system, and the system has exploitation built into it, right? And so there have to be exploiters, and there have to be exploited. That's the way it needs to be. No one has a choice in this. Now, okay, it's better to be a capitalist than it is to be a worker, right? That's true. But nobody has any choice in it. It's all forced on us by the system. Okay, very important to remember that. And Marx would say that the capitalists and the workers are victims of the system. The capitalists are victims too. Even though it's better to be a capitalist than a worker, nevertheless, the capitalists are victims too, and we'll all be better off under communism. Okay, and so in the next episode, we're going to talk about Marx's theory of the collapse of capitalism and the move to communism.